I'll never forget the look in my daughter's eyes when she said those words that broke me. Even homeless people are better fathers than you. 5 years ago, I walked away from everything, my home, my identity, my only child, and disappeared into the streets of St. Louis carrying nothing but a secret I'd promised to keep forever. I became invisible, another forgotten face in a world that had stopped seeing me. Then one cold December morning, I saw her sitting on the church steps, my daughter, homeless herself, clutching a small boy to her chest. She didn't recognize me behind my gray beard and weathered face. But as I left food for her each day and listened to her story, I discovered a truth more painful than abandonment. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones we hurt beyond repair. Now I had to decide, reveal who I really was, or remain a stranger to the daughter who believed her father had died of shame. Follow our channel for more heartbreaking true stories that will change how you see family, forgiveness, and the invisible bonds that can never truly be broken. Like and comment to let us know where you're watching from, and share your thoughts on what you would do if faced with the ultimate choice between truth and mercy. I'll never forget that Father's Day. The morning was bright and sunny in St. Louis, church bells ringing in the distance, and there I was, alone with a cheap store-bought cake on the table and a card I had purchased myself. My daughter Harper didn't call, not even a text message. The same daughter I had raised single-handedly after her mother vanished into the cold night without leaving a note, without saying goodbye, without any explanation. Harper was only 7 years old at that time, but it was as if she had grown up hating my very existence ever since. I stared at my phone that entire morning, watching notifications pop up for everyone except me. The neighbors were having barbecues. I could smell the charcoal and hear laughter floating through my open window. My television played some baseball game I wasn't really watching, just background noise to fill the emptiness of my small apartment. The truth is that deep down, I also carried a silence, a secret, a piece of the past I never managed to tell her, because every time I tried, she would interrupt me with contempt or tears. That June afternoon, when I finally gathered enough courage to speak, she looked at me with disgust and said in front of her wealthy in-laws, "Even homeless people are better fathers than you." I swallowed that remark dry. I stood up, and I left. Harper had invited me to dinner at her in-laws' mansion, probably out of obligation, not desire. Their dining room was bigger than my entire apartment, crystal glasses that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Everyone wearing clothes that looked like they'd just come off a magazine cover. And there I was, in my cleanest but clearly worn button-up shirt, the same one I'd worn to job interviews after the factory closed down. I had been unemployed for 8 months by then, not for lack of trying. At 57, nobody wanted to hire me. "We're looking for someone with different qualifications," they'd say, their eyes avoiding mine. What they meant was someone younger, cheaper, who wouldn't need health care so badly. Her father-in-law had asked about my career prospects over appetizers, emphasizing those two words like they were foreign concepts to me. I mumbled something about a promising lead at a warehouse. Harper's eyes flashed with embarrassment. She knew it was a lie. When dessert came, some fancy French thing I couldn't pronounce, Harper's husband mentioned their upcoming vacation to Europe. Her mother-in-law suggested they should take poor Harper away from all this stress. And then she looked at me, adding, "Family troubles can be so draining." That's when I tried to explain. About her mother, about why I had struggled so much, about the promises I had made. But Harper cut me off with, "Dad, nobody wants to hear your excuses. Just stop." And when I persisted, that's when she said it. The words that broke something inside me that I never knew could break. "Even homeless people are better fathers than you. At least they have excuses for failing their children." The table went silent. Her mother-in-law's eyebrows shot up in delight at the drama. Her husband looked down at his plate. And Harper, my little girl who once fell asleep on my chest every night, stared at me with eyes I no longer recognized. I didn't say a word, just placed my napkin beside my half-eaten dessert, nodded politely and walked out. I heard her husband say, "Well, that was awkward," as the door closed behind me. That same night I wrote a letter with everything I had always wanted to say. I folded it carefully, placed it in an envelope, and asked my neighbor to leave it in Harper's room. And then, I disappeared from her life. Nobody knew where I went, not even her, but that letter remained, and she never read it. I packed a small bag, just essentials, toothbrush, a change of clothes, the worn photo of Harper on her 6th birthday, holding the bicycle I had worked double shifts to afford. I left my keys on the kitchen counter, paid my last month's rent in cash, sliding it under the landlord's door. Before leaving, I stood in my apartment one last time. 30 years of life in this place. The mark on the wall where I had measured Harper's height every birthday. The dent in the doorframe from when she slammed it during her teenage years. The faded couch where we'd watched movies together every Friday night until she went to college. I whispered, "I'm sorry," to an empty room, then closed the door behind me. By morning, I would be just another invisible man in a city that had stopped seeing me long ago. And maybe that was for the best. The decision to disappear wasn't planned. I just kept walking, wandering aimlessly. I left my cell phone on a park bench, cut up my credit cards. Vanishing seemed to be the only way to stop hurting anyone anymore. Those first few days, I slept in bus terminals, then in shelters. Finally, on the street, I discovered what true silence was. But I also discovered a community of living ghosts, invisible people. It was early July when I first slept under the stars, not by choice, but because the shelter was full. The concrete beneath my back was still warm from the day's heat. I remember staring up at the night sky, thinking how strange it was that the same stars Harper and I used to count were now my ceiling. The irony wasn't lost on me. "First night?" a gruff voice asked from the darkness. Jim was his name. A Vietnam vet with one leg and eyes that had seen too much. He shared his cardboard with me that night and taught me the unwritten rules of the streets. Keep your shoes on when you sleep, don't leave anything unattended, and never ever look like you have something worth taking. By August, I had a routine: wake before dawn, wash in the public restroom at Dunkin' Donuts. The young girl who worked mornings would sometimes leave a coffee, accidentally, on the counter for me. I never knew her name, but her small kindness was like oxygen when I felt I couldn't breathe. During the day, I'd collect cans or help unload trucks behind the grocery store for a few dollars. Enough for food, not enough for dignity. I grew a beard. My clothes became part of me, and slowly I became invisible to the same society I'd been part of for decades. Harper went on with her life. I caught a glimpse of her photo on a church bulletin board once. She and her husband were expecting a baby. My heart shattered. I stood there for what felt like hours, tracing her face with my trembling finger. My grandchild would never know me, but I couldn't go back. Not after what I'd heard. I still hoped she would read the letter. My neighbor said she'd left it on the dresser. Winter came early that year. The bitter cold of Missouri doesn't forgive the unprepared. I nearly froze to death one December night, huddled behind a dumpster as snow piled around me. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I'll die. And the strange peace that came with that thought terrified me more than the cold. But Sister Margaret found me, an elderly nun who ran the soup kitchen at St. Catherine's Church. She didn't ask questions when she saw me half-conscious in the snow, just helped me to my feet and guided me to the church basement. "God isn't finished with you yet," she said, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. I began attending the church that served soup. Later, I started helping. Once a week, I cleaned the bathrooms. The ammonia smell burned my nostrils, but the work felt good, useful. When people asked my name, I simply said, "Paul." Nobody needed to know I was the father of a woman who despised me, and who would one day need me. Sister Margaret noticed I never talked about my past. "Everyone here has a story they're not ready to tell," she said one evening as we mopped the floors. "When you're ready, I'll listen." But I never was. Some wounds are too deep to expose to the light. Spring came, and with it, a strange rhythm to my new existence. I volunteered more at the church, slept in the park when weather permitted, found odd jobs here and there. I wasn't living, not really, but I was surviving. And in some ways, the simplicity of it all brought a kind of peace I hadn't known before. I often walked past Harper's neighborhood, staying far enough away to remain unseen. I learned her schedule. Tuesday mornings she went grocery shopping. Thursday afternoons were prenatal appointments. Sundays, church with her in-laws. I never approached, just watched from a distance as her belly grew rounder, her face fuller. She looked happy. That had to be enough for me. One afternoon I saw her husband emerge from a restaurant downtown, not with Harper, but with a young blonde woman. They kissed in the parking lot before driving away in separate cars. My fists clenched so tight my nails drew blood from my palms. But what could I do? I was a ghost, a homeless man whose word would mean nothing against a wealthy businessman. The seasons changed. Life went on. Harper had her baby, a boy, according to the same church bulletin board that had announced her pregnancy. I wondered if he had her eyes or my chin, if he'd inherit her stubbornness or my penchant for bad jokes. These thoughts kept me company on cold nights. 2 years passed this way, then 3, then 4. I aged decades in those years. My hair turned completely gray. Deep lines etched themselves into my face. But something else happened too. I found purpose in the small things, helping others at the church, listening to stories from fellow street dwellers, being present in a way I never was when I had a normal life. And then, 5 years after I walked away, everything changed again. Because sometimes, the world has a bitter sense of humor, and sometimes karma comes full circle in ways you could never imagine. 5 years had passed, and then, on a cold December morning, I saw something that froze my entire body. A young woman with torn clothes, hair tied in a messy knot, a deflated belly and sunken eyes sitting on the church steps. It was Harper, but she looked like someone else entirely. I felt the world spin around me. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight. St. Louis was experiencing one of the coldest winters on record, and the streets were nearly empty that morning. I was headed to St. Catherine's early. Sister Margaret had asked me to help prepare breakfast for the growing number of people seeking shelter from the bitter cold. My breath formed clouds in front of my face as I trudged through the thin layer of snow that had fallen during the night. I remember every detail of that moment, the way the weak winter sun cast long shadows across the church steps, the sound of distant traffic, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. And there she was, huddled under a threadbare blanket that was far too thin for such weather. If I hadn't been looking directly at her face, I might have walked past without recognizing her. But those eyes, they were unmistakably hers. The same eyes that had looked at me with such contempt 5 years ago. She didn't recognize me. With my gray beard, donated coat and wool hat pulled low over my ears, I looked nothing like the father she'd known. I'd aged 20 years in 5. The streets do that to you. Carve deep lines into your face, sap the color from your skin, dim the light in your eyes. I was just another old homeless man to her. She was holding a small bundle in her arms. A child, a boy of about 2 years old. He was crying softly, his little face red with cold. His tiny hands, unprotected by gloves, clutched at her jacket. She was rocking him gently, whispering something I couldn't hear. She looked up as I approached, and there was such desperation in her gaze that it knocked the wind out of me. "Please," she said to passing strangers, "can you help us? Just enough for a warm meal." But nobody stopped. They averted their eyes, quickened their pace. The same invisible shield I'd become accustomed to over the years. That strange human ability to see right through another person, to convince yourself they don't exist so you don't have to feel responsible. I didn't stop either. I couldn't. My feet carried me past her up the church steps and through the heavy wooden doors, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hang up my coat. Sister Margaret noticed immediately. "Paul, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way I had. The ghost of my former life sitting right outside, suffering in the cold. I mumbled something about not feeling well and busied myself with setting up tables in the dining hall. But my mind was racing. What was Harper doing there? Where was her husband? Their beautiful home? Had they lost everything? And why was she begging on the steps of this particular church, the same one where I had found refuge? During the service, I couldn't concentrate on a single word. Pastor Mike spoke about forgiveness and second chances, but all I could think about was my daughter outside in the cold. The daughter who thought I was dead. The daughter who had wounded me so deeply I'd walked away from my entire life. The daughter who now seemed to have lost everything herself. When the service ended, I rushed outside, my heart pounding against my ribs. But the steps were empty. She was gone. All that remained was the thin blanket left crumpled on the ground, and something small and shiny catching the light amid the snow. I bent down to pick it up. A locket. Small and silver, tarnished with age. My fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the clasp until it opened. And there, protected inside the metal heart, was a faded photograph of my wife, Harper's mother. The same locket I had hidden in the back drawer of Harper's room. I stood there, snow soaking through my worn boots as memories crashed over me like waves. I had bought this locket for my wife on our 5th anniversary. After she disappeared, I couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. So I'd hidden it, tucked away in Harper's dresser drawer beneath old school papers and childhood mementos, a place I thought no one would look. But Harper had found it, and kept it, and now, somehow, it was here, dropped on the steps of the church where I had been hiding for 5 years. My fingers closed around the locket, feeling its familiar weight. It was warm, despite the cold, as if it had been clutched tightly in someone's hand until just moments ago. I slipped it into my pocket and looked up and down the street, searching for any sign of Harper and the child, but they had vanished into the gray winter morning. As I turned to go back inside, a terrible thought struck me. What if this wasn't coincidence? What if Harper somehow knew I was here? What if the locket wasn't lost but left deliberately? A message, perhaps, or a warning. I touched my pocket where the locket rested. After all these years, a piece of my past had found its way back to me, and now I had to decide what to do about it. That night I searched for her throughout the city. I asked at shelters, in alleyways, even at hospitals. Nothing, but the locket. That was a message. Harper knew something, or someone had told her something. Sleep evaded me that night. I tossed and turned on my thin mattress in the church basement, the locket clutched in my hand like a talisman. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Harper's face, not as the desperate woman on the church steps, but as the little girl who used to run into my arms when I came home from work. The girl who begged for one more bedtime story. The girl who told me I was her hero. When dawn finally broke, I was already dressed and ready to search again. St. Louis is a big city, but the world of the homeless is surprisingly small. We know each other's territories, habits, hiding places. If Harper was truly on the streets, someone would have seen her. I started at the bus station downtown. The early morning crowd was sparse. A few business travelers with rolling suitcases, some students headed back to college after the weekend, and the regulars. By regulars, I mean the invisible ones. People who used the heated waiting area to escape the cold, moving their few possessions from bench to bench to avoid security guards who would force them to leave if they stayed in one spot too long. Old Mike, a fixture at the station for as long as I could remember, sat in his usual corner, a dirty baseball cap upturned beside him with a few coins inside. I dropped $1 in his cap and crouched down beside him. "Mike, I'm looking for someone." A young woman with a small boy. She would have been new to the streets, probably scared. Mike's roomy eyes studied my face. "That describes half the people who come through here, Paul. You gotta give me more." I hesitated before pulling out the locket. She might have been wearing this. Mike squinted at the silver heart, then shook his head. "Haven't seen it. But Bobby at the shelter on Washington mentioned a new girl. Pretty, but rough around the edges. Had a kid with her. Said she was asking about an old man who volunteers at St. Catherine's." My heart stopped. She was looking for me. But why? After all these years? After the things she'd said? I thanked Mike and hurried to the shelter on Washington Street. Bobby worked the night shift at the front desk. A former addict who'd found sobriety and dedicated his life to helping others. He confirmed what Mike had said. "Yeah, she was here 2 nights ago. Wouldn't give her name. The kid was crying something fierce. Hungry, I think. I offered them a bed, but she just kept asking questions about some old guy at St. Catherine's. Said she needed to find him urgently." "Did she say why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Bobby shrugged. "Nah, but she seemed desperate. Not the usual kind of desperate we see, you know? Like she was running from something, or someone." I spent the rest of the day combing through every shelter, soup kitchen, and known gathering spot in the city. No one had seen her since that night at the Washington Street shelter. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, just like her mother had all those years ago. As dusk fell, I found myself back at St. Catherine's, exhausted, and no closer to finding Harper than I had been that morning. Sister Margaret was locking up the kitchen when I arrived. "Paul, where have you been all day? You missed lunch service." I mumbled an apology, but Sister Margaret had known me long enough to sense something was wrong. She guided me to a chair and sat across from me, her kind eyes searching my face. "What's happened?" After 5 years of silence, of carefully guarding my past, the words spilled out of me like water from a broken dam. I told her everything. About Harper, about the cruel words that had driven me away, about seeing her on the church steps with her child, about the locket. Sister Margaret listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "This letter you wrote before you left, what did it say?" I hadn't thought about the contents of that letter in years. The pain had been too raw. I told her the truth about her mother, that she didn't abandon us by choice, that she was sick, terminal cancer. She made me promise not to tell Harper, wanted to spare her the pain of watching her die, wanted Harper to remember her as she was, not as the disease made her in those final months. And you kept that promise, Sister Margaret said softly, even when it cost you your relationship with your daughter. I nodded, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. Her mother asked me on her deathbed, how could I refuse? And the letter, you think Harper never read it? My neighbor said she left it on her dresser, but Harper never mentioned it, never called, just let me disappear. Sister Margaret's eyes held a wisdom born of decades counseling the broken and lost. Perhaps she didn't find it until recently. Perhaps that's why she's looking for you now. I remembered the letter, remembered every word I'd poured onto those pages. The explanation, the apology, the plea for understanding. Had Harper finally read it? Was that why she had the locket? Why she was asking about me at shelters? I need to find her, I said, standing up so quickly the chair scraped loudly against the floor. Sister Margaret reached for my hand. It's dark, Paul. The shelters are full by now. Start fresh in the morning. I'll ask our parish network to keep an eye out for her. Reluctantly, I agreed, but sleep eluded me again that night. I lay awake, turning the locket over and over in my hands, wondering what Harper wanted to tell me, wondering if, after all this time, there might be a chance for forgiveness, for healing. 2 weeks passed with no sign of her. I continued my search, but as each day ended without success, my hope dimmed a little more. Perhaps she'd left the city. Perhaps she'd found help elsewhere. Perhaps I'd imagined the whole thing, a desperate old man's fantasy of reconciliation. And then, on a Sunday evening, I returned to St. Catherine's after another fruitless day of searching. And there she was, sitting on the same church steps where I'd first seen her, alone this time. The boy was asleep in her arms. I approached slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. She looked up at me with suspicion in her eyes, the eyes so like her mother's. I said simply, "Are you all right?" She hesitated, studying my face for any sign of recognition. Then she replied, "My father died 5 years ago, died of shame." The words hit me like a physical blow, but what came next was even worse. The next day I left a plate of food near the steps, and a note signed Paul. Every night she ate in silence, but she never spoke to me, until one day she sat beside me and said, "I read the letter. Yesterday." My heart stopped. I had been leaving food for Harper for almost a week. Simple meals wrapped carefully in wax paper with a napkin tucked alongside. Sometimes a sandwich from the church kitchen, other times a bowl of Sister Margaret's hearty stew kept warm in a thermos. Always with the same note, "If you need anything, Paul." At first I would leave the food and walk away, watching from a distance as she cautiously approached, inspected the offering, and finally ate. The boy, my grandson, would eat first. I noticed how Harper would break the food into smaller pieces for him, only taking her own bites after he seemed satisfied. On the 5th day it was raining, a cold, relentless December rain that seemed to seep into your bones. I had brought chicken soup and fresh bread, along with a small carton of milk for the boy. I left it in our usual spot, protected from the rain by the church's overhang, and retreated to a nearby bench that offered some shelter. I didn't expect her to approach me, but she did. With the boy's hand clutched tightly in hers, she walked directly to my bench and sat down beside me. The child climbed into her lap, eyeing me with curious innocence. "You're the one leaving the food," she said. Not a question, but a statement. I nodded, unable to find my voice. Up close I could see how thin she had become. Her cheekbones pressed sharply against her skin, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. But she was still beautiful, still my Harper, despite everything. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the drumming of rain on the pavement. "Everyone needs help sometimes," I managed to say, careful to disguise my voice as much as possible. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face. I was terrified she would recognize me, and equally terrified she wouldn't. "My son's name is Ethan," she said finally, looking down at the boy who was now dozing against her chest. "He's 2.5. He's a handsome boy," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. My grandson, right there in front of me. I could see myself in the shape of his chin, in the slight curl of his hair. And I could see Harper's mother in the gentle slope of his nose, the curve of his eyelashes. "He's deaf," Harper said, her fingers gently stroking the child's hair. "Not completely. He can hear some sounds, but he'll never hear normally. That's why." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. "That's why what?" I asked gently. "That's why we're here, on the streets." She laughed bitterly. "Funny how quickly everything can fall apart, isn't it?" We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. I wanted to ask so many questions, wanted to tell her who I was, but something held me back. Fear, perhaps, or the sense that she wasn't ready yet, that I wasn't ready. The next day she was waiting for me at the bench, and the day after that. Small conversations became longer ones. She never told me her name, and I never asked. She spoke about Ethan, about the difficulties of finding safe places to sleep, about her hopes of saving enough money for a bus ticket to her aunt's house in Ohio. She never mentioned a husband, and I didn't press. It was on the 10th day that everything changed. I arrived at our usual meeting spot to find Harper clutching a wrinkled envelope, her eyes red from crying. "I read the letter," she said without preamble. "Yesterday." The world seemed to stop spinning. The sounds of the street faded away until all I could hear was the hammering of my own heart. "What letter?" I asked, knowing full well what she meant. She held up the envelope. Yellowed with age, my handwriting faded but still legible on the front. "For Harper. My father's letter," she said, her voice breaking. "The one he wrote before he disappeared." I sank onto the bench beside her, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. "How did you—" "Mrs. Abernathy, our old neighbor. She kept it all this time. She said she tried to give it to me the day after my father left. But I was so angry, so hurt, I refused to take it. Said I didn't want anything from him." Harper's fingers traced the edge of the envelope. She held onto it for 5 years. When I went back to the old neighborhood looking for help, she finally gave it to me. Tears spilled down Harper's cheeks. He told me everything. About Mom, about the cancer, about the promise he made to her. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a pain so deep it took my breath away. All those years I thought she'd abandoned us, thought she didn't love us enough to stay. And I blamed him. I blamed him for not being enough to make her stay. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. 5 years of carefully constructed walls were crumbling around me. The letter said she was diagnosed 6 months before she left. Terminal. No treatment options. She made him promise not to tell me. Wanted me to remember her as strong, vibrant, not wasting away in a hospital bed. Harper wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She went to a hospice in Colorado, died 3 weeks later, alone. She wasn't alone, I whispered before I could stop myself. Your father was with her, held her hand until the end. Harper's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. For a moment I thought I'd given myself away, but then she nodded slowly. The letter said that too, that he flew out every weekend to be with her, that he'd promised to protect me from the pain of watching her die. Fresh tears welled in her eyes. And how did I repay him? By blaming him for everything, by pushing him away when he needed me most. She clutched the letter to her chest, and now he's gone. 5 years gone, and I'll never get to tell him I'm sorry, never get to ask for his forgiveness. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her into my arms and tell her I was right here, that I had always been here, that there was nothing to forgive. But the words stuck in my throat. What would you say to him? I asked instead. If you could? Harper was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. I'd tell him I understand now. The silence, the sadness I always sensed in him but could never name. I'd tell him I'm sorry for the horrible things I said that day, that I didn't mean them, that I was just afraid. Afraid of how much I still needed him even as an adult. Afraid of losing him like I'd lost Mom. She looked down at Ethan, sleeping peacefully in her lap, unaware of the weight of the moment, and I'd ask him to forgive me for not being the daughter he deserved. In that moment I made my decision. Tomorrow I would tell her. Tomorrow I would reclaim my name, my identity, my daughter. But tonight, I would let her grief run its course. Let her reconcile with the father she thought she'd lost before introducing her to the father she'd found. I think, I said carefully, that your father would forgive you in a heartbeat, that he probably never blamed you at all. Harper's smile was sad, but genuine. You remind me of him sometimes. Something in your eyes. She shook her head. Isn't that strange? Not strange at all, I said softly. Not strange at all. I began to visit Harper every day. I never revealed who I was, but I listened to her stories. Her husband had left her when their son was born with hearing impairment. He said he didn't have the structure to raise a broken child. The morning after Harper told me about the letter, I woke before dawn. Sleep had been impossible, my mind racing with thoughts of our conversation, with the decision that lay before me. Should I tell her who I was? Would she hate me for deceiving her these past weeks? Would she understand why I'd kept my identity hidden? I arrived at our bench earlier than usual. A thermos of hot chocolate and a paper bag containing fresh muffins from the bakery down the street clutched in my trembling hands. It was a splurge I couldn't really afford, but today felt important, momentous. I needed everything to be perfect. Harper arrived with Ethan shortly after 9. The boy's face lit up when he saw me, a reaction that never failed to squeeze my heart. He'd grown comfortable with my presence, often climbing into my lap during our daily meetings. Though he couldn't hear me properly, we'd developed our own form of communication. Simple gestures, exaggerated facial expressions, the universal language of smiles and gentle touches. "You're early today," Harper said, settling beside me on the bench. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes more pronounced than usual. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, pouring hot chocolate into the thermos cap and handing it to her. "Bad night?" She nodded, helping Ethan with his muffin before taking a sip. "The shelter was full by the time we got there. We slept in the bus station." She lowered her voice. "Some men were drinking nearby. I was afraid they'd notice us." Anger flared in my chest, a protective instinct so powerful it nearly took my breath away. My daughter and grandson shouldn't be sleeping in bus stations, afraid of drunk strangers. They should be safe, warm, protected. "I might know somewhere safer," I said carefully. "St. Catherine's has a small apartment above the rectory. It's basic, but it's private. Sister Margaret mentioned they're looking for someone to help with evening meals in exchange for staying there." Hope flickered in Harper's eyes, quickly replaced by suspicion. "Why would they offer that to me? They don't know me." "I've told Sister Margaret about you," I said. "About Ethan. She wants to help." Harper was quiet for a long moment, watching Ethan as he methodically broke his muffin into tiny pieces before eating each one. "I don't take charity," she said finally. "It's not charity, it's a job, with a place to stay as part of the compensation." I leaned forward, willing her to understand. "Harper, winter's coming, real winter. You and Ethan can't stay on the streets when the temperature drops below freezing." She looked up sharply. "How do you know my name?" "I never told you." My heart stopped. A critical mistake. In my eagerness to help her, I'd slipped up. "You mentioned it," I said weakly. "The other day." "No," she said slowly. "I didn't. I never told you my name. Just like you never told me yours. Not your real one anyway." Her eyes narrowed, studying my face with new intensity. "Who are you, really? And how do you know who I am?" The moment had come, ready or not. But before I could speak, Ethan tugged at Harper's sleeve, gesturing urgently toward the street. A police car had pulled up to the curb, and 2 officers were approaching. Harper stiffened, gathering Ethan close. "We need to go," she whispered, already half rising from the bench. "Wait," I said, catching her arm. "They're not here for you. You don't know that." "I do," I insisted. "They're just here for coffee. They come every Thursday morning." Sure enough, the officers nodded to us as they passed, continuing up the church steps. Harper slowly sat back down, but her body remained tense, poised for flight. "Why are you so afraid of the police?" I asked gently. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes following the officers until they disappeared inside. Then she sighed, a sound so weary it seemed to come from her very soul. "Jeremy, my husband, he has connections. His father is Judge Wilson Thompson. When Jeremy decided he didn't want a defective child, he also decided he didn't want to pay child support." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "He told his father I was unstable, dangerous, that I threatened to harm Ethan. They filed for emergency custody." "But that's a lie," I said, outrage building in my chest. "Of course it's a lie. But who would believe me over the Thompson family? They own half the businesses in this city. The judge granted temporary custody to Jeremy while they investigated my fitness as a mother." Tears welled in her eyes. "They were going to take my baby, so I ran. The pieces fell into place. Why she was living on the streets instead of seeking help through official channels. Why she tensed whenever authority figures appeared. Why she'd been so reluctant to tell me her name. "That's why you sold everything," I said softly. "For Ethan's treatments." She nodded. "Jeremy froze our accounts when he filed for custody. I sold whatever I could. My car, my jewelry, even my wedding ring. Anything to pay for the hearing aids, the speech therapy." She stroked Ethan's hair as he leaned against her, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. "He deserves a chance. A real chance. Not to be hidden away because his father is ashamed of him." My entire body trembled with rage. How dare they? How dare this man abandon his child, my grandson, because he wasn't perfect? How dare he use his family's influence to try to take him from Harper? "We'll fight this," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the storm inside me. "I know people. A lawyer who takes pro bono cases. He could help." Harper's expression was a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and longing for. I took a deep breath, ready to reveal everything. But Ethan chose that moment to slide off the bench. He toddled over to me, arms raised in the universal request to be picked up. Without hesitation, I lifted him onto my lap. He settled against my chest with a contented sigh, his small hand coming up to pat my beard. "Vovo," he said clearly. The world stopped. Harper froze, her eyes widening in shock, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think. "What did he say?" Harper whispered. "I'm not sure," I lied, though my racing heart knew exactly what he'd said. "Grandpa." He'd called me Grandpa. Harper was staring at me now, really staring, as if seeing me for the first time. Her gaze traveled over my face, past the beard, the weathered skin, the extra years, to something deeper, something familiar. "Ethan doesn't speak often," she said quietly. "The doctors say his hearing loss makes it difficult, but when he does speak," she swallowed hard, "it's always something important, something true." I felt exposed, transparent, as if all my carefully constructed walls had suddenly turned to glass. Harper reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she touched my cheek. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice breaking on that single syllable. Before I could answer, she stood abruptly, scooping Ethan from my lap. "We have to go," she said, backing away. "We can't do this. I can't." "Harper, please," I said, standing too, no longer hiding my voice, my identity. "Let me explain." But she was already turning away, hurrying down the sidewalk with Ethan clutched to her chest. I took a step to follow, then stopped. Forcing her to confront this now, when she was already overwhelmed, wouldn't help either of us. Instead, I watched her go, my heart breaking all over again. As she reached the corner, she paused, looking back at me one last time. Then she slipped around the corner and was gone. I sank back onto the bench, burying my face in my hands. After all this time, all these careful interactions, it had taken the innocent perception of a child to tear away my disguise. Ethan had seen what Harper couldn't, or wouldn't see, the grandfather behind the homeless man's beard. I waited on that bench all day, hoping she would return. As dusk fell and the temperature dropped, Sister Margaret found me still sitting there, staring at the empty sidewalk. "She knows," I said simply. Sister Margaret sat beside me, her wise eyes full of compassion. "And she ran." I nodded, the pain in my chest almost unbearable. "Give her time, Paul," she said, patting my hand. "Some truths are too big to face all at once." As I walked back to my small room in the church basement, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under my door. My hands shook as I opened it, immediately recognizing Harper's handwriting. "If it's really you, don't look for me again." It rained like never before that night, and I didn't see her on the steps. Not on the streets either. I asked everywhere. Nobody knew, until a young man said a woman with a child had collapsed near the train line tunnel. The note trembled in my hands as I read it over and over, those 8 words burning themselves into my mind. "If it's really you, don't look for me again." I couldn't sleep that night. I paced my small room in the church basement, the concrete walls closing in around me, suffocating me with memories and regrets. By morning, the sky had darkened to an ominous gray, heavy clouds pressing down on the city like a physical weight. I went to our bench anyway, hoping against hope that Harper would be there, that she'd had time to think, to process, to forgive. But the bench sat empty, rain already beginning to spatter against its weathered wood. Throughout the day, the rain intensified, not the gentle showers of spring, but the angry deluge of a winter storm. Water cascaded down gutters, pooled in intersections, turned the streets into rushing rivers. I searched anyway, moving from shelter to shelter, showing Harper's photo to anyone who would stop long enough to look. "She's my daughter," I explained to confused desk volunteers and weary social workers. "She has a small boy with her. His name is Ethan." By evening, I was soaked through, my aging bones aching with cold, my lungs burning from the damp air. Still, I pressed on. The temperature was dropping rapidly. The rain would turn to sleet soon and then to snow. No one should be outside tonight, least of all a young woman and a toddler. I was making my way toward the last shelter on my list, a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown, when I ran into Marco. He was a young man I knew from St. Catherine's, probably in his early 20s, with tattoos covering both arms and a perpetual cigarette dangling from his lips. He worked odd jobs during the day and usually slept in his ancient Chevy when he couldn't afford a room. "Paul!" he called, ducking under an awning to escape the downpour. "Man, what are you doing out in this? You trying to catch pneumonia?" "I'm looking for someone," I said, showing him the photo of Harper I'd been carrying. "My daughter and grandson. Have you seen them?" Marco squinted at the photo, then his expression changed. "Wait, that the lady with the little boy? Blonde hair, kid about 2 or 3? My heart leapt. "Yes, have you seen them?" "About an hour ago, near the old train tunnel on Washington." Marco's face grew serious. "She didn't look good, man. I tried to tell her to get to a shelter, but she wouldn't listen. Said she was waiting for someone." The old train tunnel. It was a notorious spot, abandoned years ago when the rail line was rerouted. Now a gathering place for those with nowhere else to go. It offered shelter from the elements, but it was dangerous, prone to flooding and heavy rain, frequented by those desperate enough to risk the hazards. "She collapsed, Paul," Marco added, his voice dropping. "Just went down like someone cut her strings. The kid was crying. I was going to call an ambulance, but this other guy said he knew her, said he'd take care of it." A chill that had nothing to do with the rain ran through me. "What guy? What did he look like?" Marco shrugged. "Dunno. Well-dressed. Had a fancy car parked nearby. I figured maybe it was her husband or something. Jeremy. It had to be. He'd found them." I took off running, my heart pounding in my ears, my legs moving faster than they had in years. The rain slashed at my face, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was Harper, my little girl, unconscious, vulnerable, at the mercy of the man who had abandoned her and Ethan. The train tunnel was nearly a mile away, on the outskirts of downtown where the old industrial district met the river. By the time I reached Washington Street, my lungs were burning, my vision blurring from exhaustion and fear. The street was largely deserted. Shops closed early due to the storm, few pedestrians brave enough to venture out in such weather. I slowed to a walk, scanning the area frantically. The entrance to the tunnel was barely visible through the curtain of rain, a dark mouth in the concrete embankment that ran alongside the old tracks. As I approached, I could hear a child crying, the sound echoing hollowly from within the tunnel. "Ethan." I broke into a run again, slipping on the wet pavement, nearly falling before catching myself against a lamppost. The crying grew louder as I reached the tunnel entrance. Inside, the sound of dripping water created an eerie backdrop to Ethan's sobs. "Harper," I called, my voice bouncing back at me from the curved walls. "Ethan?" The crying stopped abruptly. Then, a small voice. "Vovo?" I moved deeper into the tunnel, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. Water trickled down the walls and pooled on the ground, soaking through my already wet shoes. The air was damp and cold, smelling of mildew and desperation. And then I saw them. Harper was lying on a piece of cardboard, her clothes soaked through, her face alarmingly pale. Ethan sat beside her, his little hands patting her cheeks as if trying to wake her. There was no sign of Jeremy or any well-dressed man. "Ethan," I whispered, rushing forward to kneel beside them. The boy looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and dirt. He reached for me immediately, his small arms wrapping around my neck as I gathered him close. "It's okay," I murmured, though I knew he couldn't hear me properly. "I'm here now. It's okay." Harper's skin was hot to the touch despite her wet clothes, a fever. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her lips cracked and dry. I placed my palm against her forehead and felt the heat radiating from her. "Harper," I said, gently shaking her shoulder. "Harper, wake up. It's me. It's Dad." Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. A soft moan escaped her lips, the only indication she was still conscious. I had to get them out of here. The tunnel was flooding slowly but steadily, water seeping in from both entrances. Soon, it would be inches deep, then feet, and Harper needed medical attention immediately. I looked around frantically, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could help. But we were alone, 3 forgotten souls in a forgotten place as the world washed away outside. With a determination born of desperation, I gathered Harper in my arms. She was lighter than she should have been, too light for a woman her height. Ethan clung to my jacket, unwilling to be separated from either of us. "Hold on tight, buddy," I said, making sure he could see my face. "We're going to get your mom some help." The journey back through the storm was a nightmare I'll never forget. Harper unconscious in my arms, Ethan wrapped around my neck like a small, terrified monkey. The rain beating down relentlessly, turning sidewalks into streams and crosswalks into small lakes. My aging body screaming in protest with every step. Muscles I hadn't properly used in years suddenly called into desperate service. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. My daughter's life depended on it. St. Catherine's was closer than the hospital, only 6 blocks away. Sister Margaret would know what to do. She always did. By the time I reached the church steps, I was barely conscious myself, running on pure adrenaline and the fierce primal need to protect my child. I staggered up the steps, nearly falling twice, Ethan whimpering against my neck. "Help!" I called as I burst through the doors, my voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. "Somebody help us!" Sister Margaret appeared from the rectory, her eyes widening at the sight of us. Drenched, exhausted, Harper limp in my arms. "Paul, what happened?" "She's sick," I gasped, my legs finally giving out as I sank to my knees on the church floor. "Fever. Found her in the tunnel. Please." Sister Margaret was already on the phone, calling for an ambulance, her voice calm and authoritative despite the chaos around her. 2 other volunteers rushed forward with blankets, helping me lower Harper gently to the floor. As they wrapped her in dry blankets, her eyes fluttered open briefly. They focused on my face for just a moment before closing again. But in that moment she whispered, "Dad, forgive me." I took her hand in mine, tears mingling with the rainwater on my face, and I wept like a child. For the first time in years, she had called me Dad. Harper survived, and gradually we began to talk again. She asked for forgiveness, but I told her there was nothing to forgive. The hatred she felt was just unresolved longing. The hospital waiting room was painted a pale institutional green that reminded me of elementary school classrooms and government buildings. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, Ethan asleep in my lap, as doctors worked to bring down Harper's fever and treat the pneumonia that had settled in her lungs. Sister Margaret had left hours ago, promising to return in the morning with clean clothes for all of us. Time moved strangely, stretching endlessly during the minutes I waited for updates, then suddenly compressing when a doctor or nurse would appear with news. "She's stabilizing," they said. "The antibiotics are working. She's young and strong. She'll pull through." I believed them because I had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. Ethan stirred in his sleep, his small hand clutching my shirt even in his dreams. Social services had come, of course. Standard procedure when a homeless child is brought to the hospital. But Sister Margaret had vouched for us, explaining the situation, promising that St. Catherine's would provide temporary housing and support once Harper was released. The social worker had been sympathetic, especially when I explained about Jeremy and his family's attempts to take Ethan away. "We'll monitor the situation," she had said. "But for now, the child should stay with family." Family. The word felt both familiar and foreign on my tongue. For 5 years I had been nobody's family, just another anonymous face on the street, another soul seeking warmth and food and the basic dignity of existence. Now suddenly, I was a father again, a grandfather, the head of a broken, battered family that somehow, against all odds, had found its way back together. Dawn was breaking when the doctor finally allowed me to see Harper. She lay in the hospital bed, pale but peaceful, an IV dripping fluids and antibiotics into her arm. Her blonde hair, freshly washed by a kind nurse, spread across the pillow like a halo. "Dad," she whispered when she saw me, her voice raspy from coughing. "You're still here. Where else would I be?" I asked, settling carefully on the edge of her bed, mindful of the tubes and wires. Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought you'd leave again. After what I wrote. After how I treated you." I took her hand, so much like her mother's, with long, elegant fingers and neatly trimmed nails even after months on the street. "I'm not going anywhere, Harper. Not ever again." "I was so angry," she said, the words tumbling out as if she'd been holding them back for years. Perhaps she had. "All this time I thought Mom left because of you, because you weren't enough. And then I blamed you for not being enough for me too, for not fixing everything when my life fell apart. I should have told you the truth about your mother," I said. "I shouldn't have kept her illness a secret." Harper shook her head weakly. "You were honoring her wishes. I understand that now." She squeezed my hand. "But why did you leave? After that dinner, after what I said, why did you just disappear?" The question hung between us, heavy with 5 years of absence and pain. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Because I believed you," I said finally. "I believed I had failed you, failed your mother. I thought you would be better off without me. And I thought I deserved to be alone." Tears slipped down Harper's cheeks. "I didn't mean it, what I said that day. I was just lashing out, trying to hurt you because I was hurting. I know that now," I said softly. But at the time it felt like the truth, like confirmation of everything I'd feared. We sat in silence for a moment, the beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital the only interruption. Then Harper asked, "Where have you been all this time?" I told her everything, about my first nights on the street, about Jim and Sister Margaret, about finding purpose at St. Catherine's. I told her about watching her from a distance, about seeing her husband with another woman, about my silent vigils outside her home. "You were so close," she whispered, "all this time." "I wanted to make sure you were okay," I said, "even if you didn't want me in your life. And then I ended up just like you," she said with a sad smile. "Homeless, invisible." "What happened, Harper? With Jeremy?" Her expression hardened. "Ethan was born with moderate hearing loss. The doctors said with early intervention, hearing aids, speech therapy, he could develop almost normally. But Jeremy," she paused, swallowing hard. "Jeremy said he couldn't handle a defective child, that it would hurt his image, his career prospects." My blood boiled at the callousness, but I kept my expression neutral, encouraging her to continue. "I thought his parents might help change his mind. They seemed so excited about becoming grandparents." She laughed bitterly. "But they were worse than Jeremy. His mother suggested we should institutionalize Ethan, send him away somewhere. His father, the judge, talked about how disabilities were a drain on society." "My God," I whispered. "I told them to go to hell," Harper said, a flash of fierce pride in her eyes. "I said I'd raise Ethan myself. That's when Jeremy filed for divorce, froze our accounts, started the custody proceedings." She looked away. "They had resources I couldn't match. Lawyers, connections. When I realized I might actually lose Ethan, I just ran. I understood then. The desperate flight, the months on the street, the fear of authority. She had been protecting her son the only way she knew how. "We'll fight this," I promised. "Together. Jeremy and his family don't get to win, not this time." Harper's eyes met mine, hope warring with doubt. "How? They have everything. We have nothing. We have the truth," I said firmly. "And we have each other. That's not nothing." The following weeks were a blur of hospital rooms, legal consultations, and quiet evenings in the small apartment above St. Catherine's Rectory that became our temporary home. Harper recovered slowly but steadily, her body healing even as our relationship began to mend. We talked for hours, about her mother, about the years we'd lost, about Ethan's future. Sister Margaret found us a lawyer through a legal aid clinic, a sharp, determined young woman named Melissa, who took on Jeremy and his family with a ferocity that surprised us all. "They're counting on intimidation," she explained during one of our strategy sessions. "But their case is weak. No evidence of unfitness, no history of instability, just a powerful family used to getting their way." It took 3 months of hearings, depositions, and tense courtroom confrontations. Judge Thompson recused himself, of course, but his influence was felt throughout the proceedings. Yet slowly, methodically, Melissa dismantled their case. She presented evidence of Jeremy's infidelity, his abandonment, his refusal to support his son financially or emotionally. She brought in experts who testified to Harper's dedication to Ethan's care, to the bond between mother and child. And in the end, we won. Harper was granted full custody. Jeremy was ordered to pay child support and contribute to Ethan's medical expenses. The Thompson family's veneer of respectability was cracked, if not completely shattered. "It's over," Harper whispered as we left the courthouse for the final time. "We're free." Some months later, I found a letter on my pillow in the small room I now rented near Harper's new apartment. It was from her, and it said, "Dad, now I understand the silence. I understand your pain. Thank you for loving me even in silence. Now it's my turn to do the same for you." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. After all these years, after all the misunderstandings and pain, my daughter had finally read my letter, and she had written back. "Today she takes care of me. I'm sick, but I'm not afraid anymore, because I know that my daughter has finally read the letter and written back to me." I sit by the window of Harper's apartment, watching Ethan play in the yard below. He wears hearing aids now, small discreet devices that help him navigate the world of sound. He's learning to speak more clearly, though he and I still communicate in our own special way, a mixture of gestures, expressions, and the deep understanding that sometimes transcends words. Harper teaches 3rd grade at a local elementary school. She's good at it, patient, kind, but firm when needed. The same qualities that make her an excellent mother. She comes home each day with stories about her students, about the small triumphs and challenges of the classroom. I listen, savoring these ordinary moments that once seemed lost to me forever. My cancer diagnosis came 6 months ago, pancreatic, the same disease that took my wife. The irony isn't lost on me, but unlike her, I won't face it alone. I won't disappear into the night, leaving those I love to wonder and grieve. I'll stay, for as long as I can, surrounded by the family I nearly lost. Harper doesn't speak of my illness often, but I see it in her eyes, the fear, the determination, the love. She researches treatments, arranges appointments, makes sure I take my medications. She has become my advocate, my caretaker, my champion, just as I once was hers. Sometimes late at night, when the pain keeps me awake, I hear her in the kitchen crying softly so I won't hear, and I understand her silence, the desire to protect those we love from our own suffering. I understand it all too well, but we don't need silence between us anymore. We've learned at last to speak our truths, to share our fears, to love without conditions or expectations, and that, perhaps, is the greatest healing of all. Sometimes the greatest wounds are inflicted by those we love most, with words that can't be unspoken and pain that seems impossible to heal. But as this father and daughter discovered, even the deepest scars can become bridges to understanding if we're brave enough to cross them. 5 years of silence, 5 years of invisible existence, all because neither could see the truth behind the other's pain. What would you have done in this father's place? Would you have revealed yourself sooner? Or would you have carried your identity to the grave, believing your child was better off without you? Life rarely gives us perfect moments of redemption. Instead, it offers broken chances, imperfect opportunities that come at the most unexpected times, like finding your estranged daughter homeless on church steps, or discovering your long-lost father has been feeding you for weeks without revealing who he is. The greatest act of love isn't always protection through silence, but vulnerability through truth, even when that truth might break us open. If this story touched your heart, please consider following our channel for more powerful stories of family, forgiveness, and the complicated beauty of human relationships. Like and share this video with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to heal what's broken, to speak what's unspoken, or to find what's been lost. Sometimes the letter we need to read has been waiting for us all along.